Following the success of his first book, renowned author and analyst Dr. Jakkie Cilliers recently launched a second book entitled Challenges and Opportunities: The Future of Africa. In this book, he looks at Africa's current development prospects in the wake of COVID-19 and also the impact of aggressive but realistic policy interventions. Dr. Cilliers recently presented an online lecture to Optentia researchers via Zoom and discussed topics from his new book. He also gave attendees a glimpse of the functionality offered by the Institute for Security Studies' new website on forecasts for Africa.
So on the y-axis, you will see it refers to globalization and nationalist populism. On the x-axis, no meaningful climate mitigation and sustainability enhanced through climate change mitigation and adaptation. So that gives us two axes, and if you look at that, that gives you four global scenarios: a sustainable world scenario, a divided world scenario, where populism really dominates, and you have some efforts at sustainability. And then a world at war, which is the third scenario, which is where populism dominates, there's no meaningful climate mitigation, versus a growth world. I start off with that representation to emphasize that I'm going to be speaking to you about Africa's long-term future, in line with so-called Agenda 2063, which is the long-term vision of the Africa Union. Agenda 2063 is really only attainable in the sustainable world scenario. In the other scenarios, which is the divided world, the world at war, or the growth world, it is very difficult for Africa to deal with the challenges that it faces. At the moment, the current trajectory of the world is very much towards this divided world scenario. This is sort of where we are headed at the moment. I think you will all recognize that. Ukraine, COVID, the rise of populism globally, and so on.
The website offers a wealth of tools and resources for researchers and policymakers and is driven by an advanced forecasting model.
We don't build the model ourselves. There's a whole team, 30, 40 years of building this model. It's open source, completely transparent, that you can actually go to download and use the model if you want to. And then I've said it's important that we also look at the global context before I embark upon showing you where we think Africa is headed and what will be possible.
Dr. Cilliers used some of the statistical functionality to shed light on Africa's current and future prospects.
What this chart shows you is it shows you historically on the left-hand side, well, there's time at the bottom, 1960 until 2043. So this is a forecast, and the data before that obviously is history, it's historical data. And what the chart shows you, or with GDP per capita on the left-hand side, is the growing divergence between average GDP per capita in Africa and GDP per capita in the rest of the world. That, by the way, is the impact of COVID. So you can immediately see the problem that Africa faces, and that is that there's a growing gap between average GDP per capita, or average incomes in Africa, versus GDP per capita in the rest of the world. Now, things have improved in Africa, particularly in the 1990s onwards. And if I were to only enlarge that section of the chart, it's quite impressive. But the reality is that since the independence period of the 1960s, the average gap between incomes in Africa and the rest of the world has steadily increased. And this analysis of the growing gap between average incomes in Africa and average incomes in the rest of the world, in actual fact, underpins a significant amount of the work that we do. In this thematic section of the website, there are scenarios on better stability, getting Africa to its demographic dividend, the impact of an agricultural revolution, better investment in health and wash infrastructure, what the impact of better education would be on Africa's growth prospects, the impact of a manufacturing transition, the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, impact of leapfrogging on Africa, more financial flows, which means foreign direct investment, more aid, remittances, the impact of large infrastructure projects, what the implications of this all is for work and jobs on Africa, the impact of better governance, impact of climate change and Africa's energy transition. We are working on power and influence at the moment. And then we look at the combined Agenda 2063. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the current path and about the combined Agenda 2063 scenario. The second part of that story, of course, is that increasingly as we look towards the long term, extreme poverty is increasingly going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. The rest of the world have managed, or will by 2030 have largely eliminated extreme poverty using, for example, the $1.90, but not in Africa. So what this chart shows us, it's a forecast from 2015 until 2043. It shows extreme poverty in the world except Africa, and it shows extreme poverty in Africa. And you can see that the absolute number of extremely poor Africans on the current path forecast, where we expect Africa to go, is in actual fact going to remain more or less constant over the forecast horizon. Now, although the impact of COVID is very evident here, the impact of the war on Ukraine is perhaps, and the associated food and fertilizer shortages is not fully included in these forecasts. So again, what that is, it gives you an idea of the challenges that the continent faces. And we could look at this in various ways. One of the problems that Africa faces is that compared to other regions, Africa is quite unequal. So what this chart would show you, it shows you Gini, the index for inequality, and it shows you here, as we all know, that Southern Africa is the least equal region, literally globally, followed by South America, followed by Central Africa, West Africa, East Africa. That's the average for the rest of the world except Africa. This is South Asia, and this is North Africa. North Africa is the most equal, using Gini, region in Africa. It is also the region in Africa that has the highest GDP per capita. Of course, the reason why that is because you had a very sort of state-centric model of development in North Africa, where the state has provided. Some of that has come through oil and gas revenues, but it has been an effort really to provide social support, state support to Africans living in North Africa. One of the reasons why Southern Africa is so unequal is because compared to any other region in Africa, indeed globally, Southern Africa, leaving our legacy behind for the time being, a legacy of colonialism and so on, all that kind of stuff, Southern Africa is a very small informal sector compared to much of the rest of Africa. So whereas in the rest of Africa, poor Africans are able to survive by participation in the informal sector. In Southern Africa, and particularly in South Africa, Namibia and Botswana, the three most unequal countries, you don't find that. And there are many reasons for that, but that's a very important driver of the very high levels of inequality that we find in Southern Africa. We have a very capital-intensive economy in South Africa, and we're a very small informal sector. In this section on the current path forecast of the future of Africa, we can look at the argument that I've just made. Africa is progressing slower than the rest of the world, whereas the world has moved on and extreme poverty is declining globally. That is not really the sense in Africa, where extreme poverty on the current path forecast in absolute numbers is probably going to steadily increase. We can speak about globalization in the sense of relative deprivation. I've spoken a little bit about inequality and growth. Then there are sections that refer to the various development plans that Africa has. You know, if Africa could have talked itself into higher development, it would have done very well. But we talk a lot, but we do very little, well, particularly in Africa, in South Africa. Africa's growing dependence on commodities. Instead of growing its manufacturing and other sectors, what is happening is Africa is deindustrializing from already low levels, and it is also premature deindustrialization. And this all means that manufacturing, which historically has been the main driver of innovation, of growth, of productivity in the rest of the world, is not playing that same role in Africa. In actual fact, increasingly Africa has services-led economies. And as we know, services is not as productivity enhancing as manufacturing. And of course, agriculture, particularly subsistence agriculture, is much less so. And the majority of African rural economic activity is located in the subsistence agricultural sector. We look at the impact of COVID-19, Africa's recurring debt challenges, and then we analyze the nature of debt in Africa. And I've tried to underline that although things are improving in Africa, it is happening more slowly than in the rest of the world. And in Africa, on its current trajectory, is in actual fact falling further and further behind on some indicators. It is catching up on others. Let's say life expectancy, infant mortality, Africa is catching up. The positive, the Agenda 2063 positive growth trajectory for Africa is only really possible in the sustainable world scenario, where there is a global compact to allow Africa to grow, a rules-based world that invests and provides the opportunity for Africa's growth. Now, at the moment, that of course is not possible. It's not likely. Sorry, it's not possible. It's not likely. Where we see ourselves going is more towards a divided world, the rise of populism, and so on. I think at the moment, apart from the escalation of the war in Ukraine to become a war between Russia and the West, escalating into a nuclear conflict, and/or that China invades Taiwan, and that unlocks. These are some of the elements that one could foresee in terms of conflict. But more likely, what we have seen is that we see a rise of pandemics globally. The latest is the monkey virus with COVID. And this is going to increase because it's driven by the massive population increase and proximity between nature and humanity that we've seen globally. But the other, I would say, big ticket item is the acceleration of climate change impact. We see in Europe now, we see rivers drying up. We see rapid escalation in the impact of climate change. So these are all examples of disruptive events that could have a very large impact on the long-term future of Africa. So what I'm showing you here, within the International Futures Forecasting Platform, we forecast hydro, nuclear, other renewables, coal, oil, and gas. These are the types of energy that we forecast. So this is gas. This is the global energy production by type up until 2063. And you can see the growth of other renewables, and you can see eventually the decline in gas, in oil, in oil and coal. So what is happening in Africa, I think there is a chart here, is that, yeah. So this is the forecast for Africa's energy transition. So this is oil, gas, coal, other renewables, hydro. So what you see here is a an energy future. This is in the current path forecast where we think Africa is headed, that is still quite heavily dependent on oil, but that gas plays a much larger role. Coal, and you see renewables only taking off really, okay, so that's about from 2030 onwards, and it remains relatively small. But the potential for renewables to play a much larger role is huge. The current thinking is that the transition will be that we could go, in a sense, directly to gas, and from there to renewables. But you are quite right that we live in a world where the rest of the world, particularly the West, has industrialized and released carbon that now is a global threat to all of us. But the problem is that that is a threat to all of us. So we all have to make our contribution. Historically, if you look back, we all think that the past was somehow better. The reality is not. You know, as recently as the 1950s, when I was born, by the way, 2/3 or 3/4 of the world lived in extreme poverty. We live in an era of historically unprecedented wealth and prosperity. Yes, we are struggling. We are struggling, particularly in South Africa at the moment, but all countries are struggling. So there is no, you know, I'm not trying to pretend that things, particularly in South Africa, are concerning. Whether you're talking potholes, you're talking Eskom, or you're talking about governance, these are all true. But over long time horizons, we continue to live in an extraordinary period of prosperity. And we have to assume ownership of our own future. And for example, in South Africa, take responsibility for trying to change things. Very often what is happening in South Africa is that we are so consumed with race and all of these issues that we retreat into our enclaves without accepting that the future of South Africa, it's part of our responsibility to also try and shape that future. So yes, I'm concerned, I'm worried. I gave you my two really long-term concerns about labor and about climate change, and then the world, where the world may be headed. But every time, in South Africa and globally, we teeter on the edge of the precipice. Well, South Africa does this. We're past masters at this, and then we step back, and then we move forward. And hopefully, that's where we are, because we are in South Africa seeing very important changes within the ruling party, within the ANC. Whose dominance in 2024 it will certainly fall below 50%, and then new options open themselves for South Africa, and we could enter a difficult or a positive period going forward.